Allumage Vulcain. Allumage EAP, décollage.
On July 5th, 2023, assuming everything goes as planned, the history of Europe's most successful launch vehicle will finally come to an end. A launch vehicle that hasn't experienced a failure in over 2 decades. A launch vehicle that has been carrying heavy payloads to space for almost 3 decades. A launch vehicle that, until recently, was the most powerful rocket in service on the planet. This has been an extraordinary journey that Arianespace has taken us on, with some of the most amazing scientific accomplishments being delivered by this extraordinary rocket. But it's a rocket with a great number of controversial problems as well. It's expensive, it's out of date, it's a rocket that really needs to go out of service at this point, a rocket that is desperately in need of replacement, and yet its replacement, Ariane 6, is still at least a year away from entering service. But even though Ariane 5 is not carrying a particularly important payload this time, even though Ariane 5 is expensive and non-reusable, and given that Ariane 5 flew for the first time in 1996, it's kind of difficult for us to expect it to be reusable, but nevertheless, before Europe's most successful rocket flies for the last time, I think that it's important for us to recognize its many accomplishments. There are so many amazing scientific discoveries that simply would not have been possible without this rocket. Its reliability, its heavy lift capabilities, all of these things made so many scientific payloads carried by Ariane 5, from the highly successful Newton back in 1999 to the astonishingly successful James Webb 22 years later, possible. Any other rocket might have had a difficult time accomplishing the same thing. Even though Falcon Heavy has proven itself to be a very reliable heavy lift rocket as well, it doesn't have near the operational success history that Ariane 5 has, and Falcon 9 could not have carried such heavy payloads. So we're going to have a quick look at the history of this remarkable rocket and why, given the fact that Europe has no operational replacement for it, given the fact that Europe has no operational launch vehicle whatsoever after July 5th, its absence is going to have a devastating effect on current spaceflight, and we are going to miss it very, very much. Good afternoon, happy 4th of July to my US viewers, and welcome to the Angry Astronaut. So, for those of you who have been watching my channel for some time, you may know that I've been pretty harsh on Arianespace. And for good reason, in my opinion. They have not made a practice of pursuing reusability until very recently. As a result, the trouble-laden Ariane 6 is going to be very expensive, especially when compared to other heavy lift rockets. Indeed, even the Vega rockets from Arianespace are not going to be remotely competitive against a lot of the smaller launch vehicles that are going to come out in Europe, let alone companies like Rocket Lab and others that have found a much more inexpensive way of delivering small payloads. But Arianespace stays in business largely because of government subsidies. Especially recently, many of the recent Ariane 5 missions have been affordable only because European governments have made them so. That having been said, though, Ariane 5 is a magnificent rocket that is from a previous time, a generation that didn't know anything about reusability, a generation that looked at the space shuttle and said maybe reusability is never going to be a practical thing. So Ariane 5, for a very good reason, is not a reusable rocket, is an expensive rocket, but has accomplished some extraordinary things.
Spicy. Please welcome the Angry Astronaut.
Oh yeah, and let me ask you guys for a quick favor. For those of you who remember To the Future, well, this channel still exists with different presenters these days, and I'm one of these new presenters. So please tune in to this latest episode where I'm talking about the US Space Force, as you can see, and I would very much appreciate it. Links in the description. Let's get on with Ariane 5. One of its earliest successes took place on December 10th, 1999 with a successful deployment of the X-ray Multi-Mirror Mission, or the XMMNewton, a telescope that, after all these years, is still going strong. Instead of one X-ray telescope, this one is actually 3. Each of the telescopes contains 58 high-precision nested mirrors, giving it a total collection area that is nearly the size of a tennis court, even though each of these mirrors is only 30 centimeters wide, and that's because each telescope has 58 wafer-thin mirrors curved into cylinders and nested inside one another, kind of like Russian dolls. The mirrors sit only 25 microns apart. Talk about precision, about a quarter the width of a human hair. Together, these mirrors allow astronomers to make long, uninterrupted observations with unprecedented accuracy, and they've been doing this for almost a quarter of a century without let-up. The telescope works in conjunction with 3 European photon imaging cameras that detect extremely weak X-ray radiation and a reflection grating spectrometer which analyzes wavelengths in more detail. And the final instrument, the optical UV monitor, which ESA describes as a scaled-down version of the Hubble Space Telescope, can view X-rays as well as ultraviolet and visible light as well. It's only 30 centimeters in diameter and yet has the power of a 4-meter telescope on Earth simply because it flies above the effects of Earth's atmosphere. And here's the most amazing thing about this telescope. It was placed in a very unusual orbit, a 48-hour orbit that's highly elliptical that takes the instrument outside of the radiation belt surrounding Earth for 40 of these 48 hours, offering the longest possible observation periods that spend most of their time outside of Earth's shadow. An orbit like this is not something you use a small rocket to achieve, especially with an instrument this heavy. You have to use a heavy lift rocket, and Ariane 5 served its purpose admirably. Over the last 24 years, Newton has studied the X-ray emission characteristics of cosmic sources such as clusters of galaxies, starburst galaxies, active galaxy nuclei, black holes, neutron stars, and pulsars. The discoveries made by this instrument are legion. They include a pulsar that switches between bright and quiet modes, a pulsar type that had never been found before. Also, it detected intergalactic matter, something that's very difficult to find, something we know that exists, but hadn't really been directly observed until Newton. Also, a black hole devouring a star. For a decade, decades time frame, something that also had not been observed, at least not for such a long period of time. And also the auroras of Jupiter were studied in detail by this amazing instrument. An instrument you probably have never heard of. I sure don't remember it being talked about very much, but Ariane 5 was responsible for it being properly deployed, and it will probably continue to function for at least another 10 years. And we are only just getting started with Ariane 5's accomplishments. Also, the Bepi-Colombo mission, which was launched on October 20th, 2018, almost 2 decades after Newton. Many of you may recall that Bepi-Colombo has been in the news recently while it was making its third flyby of Mercury, the planet that it was targeted towards in the first place. Bepi-Colombo is actually 3 spacecraft that were launched together, weighing a total of over 4 metric tons, one of the reasons why you needed a heavy lift rocket in order to carry this thing all the way to Mercury. And this consists of the Mercury Planetary Orbiter, built by ESA, that has 11 scientific instruments that study Mercury's surface, interior structure, composition, atmosphere, and magnetic field. And then you have the Mercury Magnetosphere Orbiter, also nicknamed MEO, that was built by JAXA. It carries instruments mostly dedicated to the study of Mercury's magnetic field, as well as the space environment around Mercury. And then finally, the Mercury Transfer Module, a spacecraft built by ESA, which carries the propulsion system that gets all 3 spacecraft to Mercury. This was not an easy mission to carry out. It's very difficult and very dangerous to send a spacecraft this close to the sun without it being destroyed. Last year, thanks to your generous support, I had an opportunity to see a mock-up of this spacecraft up close and personal and learn about all the detailed methods that were undertaken to keep it safe from the intense radiation and heat experienced by anything that passes this close to the sun. For example, ESA had to install next-level multi-layer insulation. Typical spacecraft might have a multi-layer insulation blanket, but only one of them, whereas Bepi-Colombo had to have 3 or 4 of them with 10 to 20 layers apiece. The insulation alone added 94 kilograms to the Mercury Planetary Orbiter, to say nothing of the other 2 spacecraft. The types of materials that are typically used in spacecraft construction were put aside from layers containing titanium, also ceramic fabric 3M Nextel, which is normally used in ovens and spacecraft heat shields, plus multiple layers of aluminum, and they had to be attached carefully without loose fibers that might blind Bepi-Colombo's delicate optical cameras. But this still wasn't enough. Also, waste heat is transported to a radiator via a dense network of heat pipes. Think of these as closed-loop equivalent of human sweat glands. They are partially filled with liquid that vaporizes into gas when heated, traveling to the colder far ends of the spacecraft to condense again, and then flowing back to the warm sides so the process continues. All of these things make Bepi-Colombo very heavy, and that's why Ariane 5 was necessary. And then we have ESA resupply to the ISS. I'll bet a lot of you didn't know that ESA actually did resupply the International Space Station, but they did with a spacecraft called the Jules Verne, also delivered by the Ariane 5, a vehicle that was not reusable like Dragon, which is one of the reasons why it had to be abandoned. It was expensive, but definitely did the job it was designed to do at the time. This promotional video from ESA, way back in the early 2000s, illustrates the function of Jules Verne, kind of a space-based pizza lorry. But instead of carrying pizza, well, it probably carried a little bit of pizza on top of its other food supplies, but it also carried 7 tons worth of experiments, fuel, water, and other supplies from Earth to the ISS. It also served as a 22 cubic meter extension to the ISS, giving extra space for the astronauts and cosmonauts in the ISS crew, back in the days where the ISS didn't have quite so many pressurized modules, so that was pretty important. And of course, it also got loaded up with waste from the ISS and disposed of it during its return to Earth. The Jules Verne was a pretty colossal spacecraft. It weighed over 20 metric tons at takeoff, as opposed to just over 12.5 metric tons for the SpaceX Dragon, and it could carry more cargo than the Dragon as well. But as I mentioned before, it was an extremely costly way of resupplying the ISS, although it did have the ability to provide ISS reboost, a capability would be nice to have right now, given the fact that only the Russians can really do this with their Progress resupply ships. The Jules Verne was an extremely spacious and quiet place, and astronauts used to actually enjoy sleeping inside this vehicle when it was docked to the ISS, but unfortunately, it stopped visiting the station in 2014. The 5 vehicles involved in these resupply missions were called the Jules Verne, the Johannes Kepler, the Eduardo Amaldi, the Albert Einstein, and the Georges Lemaitre. And the list goes on and on. I don't have enough time to thoroughly talk about all of these things, so I'm just going to mention them briefly. The Herschel Space Observatory and the Planck probe. These have accomplished amazing things as well. They were launched on an Ariane 5 on May 14th, 2009, and like the James Webb Space Telescope, they were parked at the Earth-Sun Lagrange point about 1.5 million kilometers away from Earth. They remained in operation from 2009 until June 2013 for the Space Observatory and October 2013 for the Planck probe. At the time, Herschel was the largest infrared telescope to ever be launched from Earth and was only recently dethroned by the James Webb Space Telescope, which of course was also launched on an Ariane 5, but I'll get to that in a little bit. Herschel was outfitted with the largest mirror ever sent to space at that time, and its mission propelled research into the early universe, star formation, and the atmospheres of planets and moons in our own solar system, whereas Planck was designed to study the cosmic microwave background, radiation associated with the Big Bang, and the early universe. Planck's highly sensitive instruments allowed the probe to take unprecedented measurements, which scientists used to help determine the age of the universe and determine the first CMB, or cosmic microwave background map, of the entire sky. And then there was the incredibly ambitious Rosetta mission, which was launched on an Ariane 5 way back on March 2nd, 2004. And this probe, along with its lander Philae, spent 10 years catching up to Comet 67P, arriving at its destination on August 6, 2014, when Rosetta became the first spacecraft ever to orbit a comet. And as you can see, it sent back some incredible views of a comet in unparalleled detail. And then on November 12th of the same year, the Philae lander detached from Rosetta to attempt the first ever landing on a comet's surface. This didn't go all that smoothly, of course, and one wouldn't really expect it to. This was an incredibly difficult operation. Anchoring harpoons designed to latch onto the comet during touchdown failed to fire, so the spacecraft had to try to land without them, and it bounced twice before settling on the surface. When it did come down for good, a cliff kept the lander in almost permanent shadow, obscuring the probe's solar panels from the sun. Therefore, Rosetta lost contact with the lander about 3 days later, preventing it from meeting the majority of its mission objectives. But it landed on a comet and survived for 3 days. That was an amazing accomplishment no matter which way you look at it. And Rosetta remained in orbit around this comet for 2 more years, conducting studies of the comet's nucleus and changes caused by its varying proximity to the sun. And then on July 2015, 67P was positioned just right for some sunlight to reach Philae, and the lander momentarily woke up. Philae made contact with Rosetta orbiter a few times during that short span before shutting off, for the final time. And then on September 30th, 2016, with its mission at an end, Rosetta aimed itself towards 67P and performed a kamikaze dive into the comet's frigid surface. What an amazing accomplishment, and one that really isn't talked about a whole lot today. And then we have the most modern missions that have been undertaken by Ariane 5, the JUICE mission, which I'm not going to talk about that much because I've already covered it in a previous video that will be linked at the end of this one. And then finally, the historic James Webb Space Telescope, whose mission has really only just begun. And both of these missions were also delivered flawlessly by the heavy lift Ariane 5. So yes, Ariane 5 is expensive. Yes, it's outdated. Sure, it's not reusable. Who gives a damn? The last time this rocket experienced a mission-ending anomaly was back at the end of 2002, over 20 years ago. And ever since then, Ariane 5 has flawlessly carried out mission after mission and helped accomplish some of the most amazing scientific achievements in the history of our species. So if you happen to be a space launch provider, you can only hope to have a rocket as good as Ariane 5. And when it is finally put to rest tomorrow, I think we can look back on the history of this rocket and say thank you. Please like, please subscribe. Also, please consider checking the description for various ways to support this content. Also, don't forget the To the Future episode. And as always, stay angry about space.